Tel Aviv 360, Israel's largest and most diverse podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Back to the Middle East, בחזרה למזרח התיכון. I'm your host, Jonathan Franco. And this time we're going to do things a little differently. We're going to do one episode in English to entice our international listeners as well. Today we're going to talk in light of the recent war and its regional and international implications. We're going to talk a little bit about what it did to those countries who were brought into the war, even though they never entered it, which is the Gulf states. Today we have with us Dr. Brandon Friedman, who is the Director of Research and a Senior Researcher here in the Moshe Dayan Center, an expert on the Gulf states. Hello, Brandon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. And we have Dr. Daniela Julia Traub, an international relations expert and an expert on normalization between Muslim countries, including, of course, the Gulf states and Israel. Nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. So let's jump right into it. I would love if we could start with relations that the Gulf states had with Israel before the whole war happened. So maybe we could start with the Emirates, the one country that went into full normalization with Israel in 2021. Yes,
In the spirit of making this a little bit interesting, I'm going to...
it's very interesting.
challenge the question a little bit, right? So if we're talking about the war, referring to the war that started at the end of February, I would say that the war with Iran really goes back to October 7th, 2023. I see Iran as very much involved in Hamas's war, this unity of the fronts that took place in sort of the 2 years leading up to October 7th, 2023. So when we talk about, let's look at the Gulf and their relations before the war with Iran. We really need to say when exactly we're talking about, right? Or we're talking about January 2026, or are we going back before October 7th, 2023? And I say that just to help our listeners orient themselves about what we're talking about.
Absolutely. We should also say that this war was only the second round where Iran and Israel had their first direct war, which is also part of this bigger scheme of things. So how about we start with the Emirates? So a country that went through with normalization, which is very unique. Do we see this war in any kind of meaning affecting this normalization? Did it change it? Maybe it changed Emirati perception of Israel and or the United States.
So for me, when we touch upon that topic of the UAE, I would go back to 2004 when Mohammed bin Zayed and Khalifa bin Zayed rose up to power. And that's where it all started to shift. Now, they launched in about 2010 a program called Vision 2021, trying to turn the Emirates, to shift the Emirates away from oil towards a knowledge-based economy. Now, they also had security problems such as terrorism and extreme Islam. And they also had Iran on the border and the dispute they have around the 3 islands that Iran claims to be theirs. Yet, they were also trying to move towards a different kind of economy, an economy that could be supported by other knowledge-based economies such as Israel. So from 2010, even if it's behind the scenes, we can see that the UAE is coming closer and closer towards Israel until 2020, where we see the normalization that took place. So we had a pretty good and steady relationship. It did go back and forth, and this is something that happens with the UAE many times. When they feel threatened, meaning threatened by the relationship with Israel, they take a step back publicly, but the trade continues the same. The public projects stop, but economically wise, it continues. The same happened when we dealt with Mabrouch in Dubai, and the same happened now with the war in 2023. And that's they basically took a step back But now, the last half a year, they're coming back to cooperating with Israel, also publicly, and also in different kinds of projects, if it's from the academia to tech.
Something you want to add here, Brandon? Or?
Yeah, I'd just say if we listen more recently to the statements coming out from the senior diplomatic advisor to MBZ, Anwar Gargash, what we hear is that the Emirates need to invest more in their relationship with the United States, but also in Israel. And for those who've been following the war closely, you see there have been a series of secret flights that go back and forth between the Emirates and Israel, and military coordination behind the scenes, which I think Daniela was alluding to. So I think the Emirates have made a strategic decision. And I don't think necessarily the war weakens or changes that decision, if anything, the opposite. And I think we in Israel just need not take it for granted. It's a relationship that requires investment. It requires nurturing and servicing. And I think everyone's aware of that.
Great. By the way, we're going to touch a bit later on this issue of, did this war make them more inclined to rely on Israel and the U.S. or the other way around? We're gonna dedicate a bit of the discussion to that question. Next, let's say a few words about Saudi Arabia. There, I think the 7 October issue is really, really apparent, right? Because before 7 October, we saw reports, including Mohammed bin Suleiman's statement that normalization is coming closer and closer to happen. And then the whole thing was interrupted by 7 October attack, and Saudi Arabia seemingly took a step back. Do you feel that the conflict with Iran somehow changed this? Or, you know what, maybe let's start a step back, actually. What 7 October did to that normalization, and do you see any changes following the Iran war in some way?
Sure. Let me say two things, and I'll try to keep it brief. I think the first is that Mohammed bin Salman definitely wanted normalization with Israel. I think in probably the 3 years leading up to October 7th, it was clear that that was a direction the Saudis were willing to move towards. What changed is obviously how the Saudi public felt about normalization. So that's one. The second point that I think is really important, and it dovetails with something Daniela already mentioned, which is, the Saudis, in trying to, I would say, restart the relationship with the United States, have rolled out this ambitious program in investment in artificial intelligence. And I think that goes to the heart of this sort of regional ambition to develop the knowledge-based economy. And I think that these...
As opposed to an oil economy that...
diversify their economies,
yes.
So that they're less dependent on oil and gas, which obviously has a relevance to the current context. But I think the point there is that the Saudis saw Israel as a high-tech power and a potential partner in whatever their ambition was in terms of a regional artificial intelligence strategy. And so I think those two things are important to bear in mind.
I would maybe take a different angle and speak about 2013. In 2013, Beijing decided on creating the Road and Belt Initiative. By doing that, they tried to gain influence.
Maybe say a word about it, just...
Yeah, so it's infrastructure through the sea and through land in order to connect trade, energy, and technology in the quickest way possible, and empower China through that. Now, when you have such a big vision, you'll have a different country that's a bit threatened by that, which wasn't the case in 2013. Obama wasn't threatened, and he thought that it's okay that any country does what they want. In 2016, Trump comes up to power, and in 2018, the United States decide that China is a definite threat to the United States. And they decide to invest in different coalitions through the Middle East. As an example, let's say IMEC is supposed to combat the Chinese initiative. Okay, so the Saudis found themselves in the middle.
Maybe say a word also about what IMEC is.
Yes, IMEC is exactly the same as what the Chinese were doing, but it starts in India, goes through Saudi Arabia, it goes through Israel, which is very important to Israel and the UAE, because the UAE are a very important port in that connection, and that goes up through Jordan and up to Europe.
Greece. Yeah.
Exactly, and that actually weakens not only China, it also weakens Iran, and it also weakens Russia, because you also
Turkey.
and Turkey, and you also have different corridors. You have the corridor of Luzon in the Philippines and in Japan, also Trump's idea, and also Azerbaijan, Armenia corridor, that's the most efficient one that's running currently, that bypasses Iran. So anyway, getting to the point, Saudi Arabia decided to hedge, meaning they depended economically on China, but most militarily wise on the US. And they didn't really choose a side. While Israel did choose a side, Iran had to choose a side because they had sanctions, okay? So the Saudis chose to balance themselves between the two big rivals, which brought to the fact that they didn't choose. And I feel that Ben Salman is still not choosing. And he's still trying to play that game, a dangerous game, because Trump doesn't like it. We can see the example of India, where they have 50% tariffs that Trump put on them because India's playing the same game. They're not choosing a side.
Interesting. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing about the Saudis and their relationship with China and the United States. I think the Saudis realized, and it was a realization that started with Obama but continued on to the Iranian attack on Saudi oil facilities in September 2019, that the security provider relationship of the United States to Saudi Arabia, something that really reached its peak with the first Gulf War in 1990-91, was eroding, that the Americans didn't seem willing or to invest in protecting the kingdom the way they had in 1990-91. And I think it reached this sort of apex in 2019 when the Iranians attacked the largest Saudi refinery complex, and Trump, who was president at the time, didn't really respond, said it's not the U.S. war. And the Saudis felt that they no longer had the same kind of protection from the United States that they had since 1990-91. And the Saudis, they tried this, as Daniela articulated perfectly, tried to play this complex game where they were sort of flirting with China in order to get the Americans to pay more attention to them. The Americans, up until recently, didn't seem all that interested. And you could argue that the Saudis felt that they didn't really have sort of a protector in the way that they had for a long time. And so I think the Saudi foreign policy has been searching for a new strategy. You know, how can we protect ourselves if we don't have American protection? Mm-hmm. The Chinese are not going to protect the Saudis the way the Americans did in 1990-91. And so the Saudis are trying this diversification strategy, hoping that if they're friends with everyone will have a stake in protecting them, or at least
not hurting them.
Right, exactly. Yes. And so the question is, what really is it working? And I think it's really being pressure tested right now during this war.
So I think it's really interesting, and I want to add up to what you said, that we also saw it with the Trump administration's reluctance to go too far with the Houthis. We had that moment in time during this war where they basically just pulled out and said, we did amazingly, and just left it as it was.
Early 2025, I think it was.
2025, mm-hmm. Yeah. And then now there was also this war where based on the reports that I read at least, people in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, first of all, they were unhappy that they were dragged into this war, but they were also unhappy that it kind of ended inconclusively, as opposed to, if you already started this war. They used the term the injured lion. Do not leave us with an injured lion in Iran, which would come back to hurt us. So then this whole paradigm is sort of collapsing in the sense that Iran proved itself willing to hurt the Saudis despite the hedging, whereas the United States might not seem to them anymore like a protector. Like this trend is continuing, so I think it would be very interesting to see where it goes. You wanted to say something?
First of all, I don't think it's right to say that the war has ended. We still don't know where it's going. And wars aren't linear. It's not like we move forward and then it ends. It goes backwards, forward. It escalates, it de-escalates. We move to different tactics like sanctions or diplomacy in order to get to the wanted outcome. And that's what Trump's doing now, and we don't know how it's going to develop. So we don't know if he actually left them in this state. Let's hope that not.
That's an important disclaimer.
Yeah.
No, it's true.
If I could just add one quick point on that, another hedging policy that was talked about a lot with respect to the Saudis was the Saudis' regional détente, the rapprochement with Iran in March 2023, and a lot of people feel that. And the Saudis haven't abandoned that policy officially, meaning if you look at who absorbed in the Gulf the majority of the Iranian attacks, the Saudis came out fairly well, meaning the Iranians attacked them, but they didn't attack them in the scale and mass that they did the Emirates or Kuwait or Bahrain or even Qatar. And so there's some in Saudi Arabia who are saying, look, maybe this China-brokered détente with Iran in 2023 was wise and did serve our purpose. This diversification of our security relationships did pay a dividend. There's some who are saying that. On the other hand, you have all these reports, and it's hard to know what's true, that the Saudis have been egging the Trump administration on. A lot of people talk about how Israel was involved in convincing the Trump administration to go to war in Iran. But I would say just as important, if not more, was Mohammed bin Salman's voice behind the scenes saying to the Americans, finish the job, as you mentioned. And so I think when you look at the Saudis, they're playing, in some respects, a very cynical game.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And it's also true in the fact that there was a sense that the only country that can actually control Iran was China, because they also managed to broker that, but they also were receiving most of the oil. Therefore, if they pull out, Iran actually collapses. And that's also what we see with Trump now trying to stop the oil arriving to China. That's the most important thing. It's not only in Hormuz, but it's also in Indonesia and in other different ports and connecting points around the globe where we see he's trying to prevent the oil to arrive to China and therefore weaken China. So the sense that China could control Iran was extremely important in the decision of Saudi to pull back. And they actually decided with the UAE to pull back already in 2020. They were fighting the Houthis, but they decided to stop with that. They had sanctions on Qatar, but again, they decided to stop with that. They went to a more, let's say, peaceful kind of diplomacy in the area.
Well, by the way, one of the more cynical hypotheses about what the Saudis have been doing with respect to the Houthis is the Houthis have stayed on the sideline in this round of war, right, since late February up until now. And so there's a lot been written about why they haven't been, with the exception of a few symbolic attacks, why they haven't really joined the fight, closed the Bab al-Mandeb. And one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons that's been floated is that the Saudis are paying them $500 million to sit on the sidelines. And that for the Houthis who badly need that money, it lets them pay their employees, their supporters, and keep their governing enterprise afloat. The Saudis are hearkening back to what I would say is the traditional Saudi national security strategy, which Professor Yossi Costner always used to refer to as the dollar diplomacy of the Saudis. And so we're seeing that too. The Saudi toolbox is rich.
That's very interesting. Soon we're going to touch on Qatar, which, there were also reports of them offering the Iranians money in exchange to not attacking them. I think that's a really interesting issue that came up in this war. So without further ado, let's go to Qatar. Still on the issue of Israel and Iran, etc. A very interesting country. Their desire to sort of mediate between the U.S. and Iran, between Israel and Hamas, between all sorts of regional powers. That has been their strategy for a long time, situating themselves as mediators. What would you say? Well, and something very interesting is that Qatar, I think also during the war itself, still gave a lot of airtime in its outlets to Iranian officials, still did not, speak too badly of Iran and tried to still be a mediator while receiving, Iranian attacks and drones and missiles. What kind of reorientation, if there is any, do you feel that happened there? And what was it like before? How did it change, if it changed?
So let me start with probably the most articulate spokesperson that I've heard for the Qatari point of view is Nawaf bin Mubarak Al-Thani, who's a retired general. And he's said things are never going to be the same again for Qatar. They've experienced $20 billion in economic damage with the attacks on their natural gas facilities. Their GDP is $54 billion. That gives you a sense of the scale of $20 billion of damage. But at the same time, he's also said that Qatar can't escape its geography. And Iran is its neighbor, and its most valuable gas assets border Iran's most valuable gas assets. So I think that for Qatar, things have definitely changed in terms of its relationship with Iran, something it tried to very carefully manage over the years. On the other hand, I think it can't escape that Iran is its neighbor, and I think you have to take those two things into account.
It's funny because it's exactly the problem Azerbaijan has. It's bordered by Russia and Iran. And they're also, I remember one of the high-ranking diplomats came here and he said, listen, I know you guys want us to choose and to publicly say we're with you, but we are with you, but we still have to play this very difficult game because we have really horrible neighbors. So.
I think that's really an interesting gap of perception between maybe Israel and to some extent also the United States, at least in the early stages of the war, and the Gulf states, in the sense that I think we heard a lot of speeches by Trump and by Netanyahu and by other officials in that area in the beginning of the war, sort of insinuating that they were hoping that at least the first strike is going to, send the Iranian people out to the street, topple the regime, all that stuff. But I think that their work assumption in all the Gulf countries was that the Iranian regime is staying. We're not making big bets right now. We're going to have to live with whatever is left after the dust settles. And I think that created also an interesting difference in the discourse that was publicly transmitted.
I think, first of all, particularly for Qatar, it's important to point out they don't have an alternative in terms of their economy to getting their gas to market. So the Emiratis have a port, Fujairah, which enables them to go around the Strait of Hormuz and therefore export their oil without necessarily being a prisoner or hostage to Iran. Same goes for the Saudis with Yanbu and their ability, this east-west pipeline that they invested in for years and now has paid off. For the Qataris, they don't have that alternative, meaning they are dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. It needs to be resolved. And so they can't dream of a different Iranian regime. They have to deal with the Iranian regime that exists at the time, now. And so I think the Qataris, and that's a little bit, I guess, alludes to what Nawaf bin Mubarak was referring to as we can't escape geography. They are prisoner to an extent. They are prisoner of Iranian politics. And so I think Daniela's point that the wars may not be over. Certainly the story of politics in Iran may not be over. In fact, for those who believed that perhaps the regime would fall after the decapitation strike on Khamenei, I think serious Iranian experts didn't really believe that. Maybe some in the U.S. and in Israel believed it. But I think once the war is really over, it will be interesting to see what happens in Iranian politics and how the Gulf states respond to it. And they've been neighbors for Iran for a long time, and I think they watch Iran as closely as we do here in Israel. So I think that there's a long way to go in this story. But Qatar certainly has a bit of a unique position vis-a-vis, let's say, the Emiratis or the Saudis.
They always did have a unique position in lots of Gulf issues. Would you like to say a few words maybe about the other Gulf states that maybe don't receive as much airtime, definitely not here in Israel, but are also important, maybe Bahrain or Oman, Oman has been interestingly brought up in the context of maybe managing the Straits of Hormuz with Iran, which I thought was really interesting.
I'll say a word about Bahrain. I think it's really important. One of the interesting developments is Bahrain, I think, has grown closer to the Emirates over the course of this war. Bahrain was always identified as being almost identical in its approach to regional issues, both within the Gulf, but also in the broader Middle East, with the Saudis. And I think during the course of the war, we've seen the Bahrainis and the Emiratis get closer to one another. And I think the reason is that they both see the future as being more United States rather than less, which is a little bit different than the Saudis. So I think...
what would you say the Saudi standpoint? That they want to keep up the hedging, or what? How would you define the...
Yeah, they're not decisive yet. They're still playing that game. Because in the end, we still don't know how this war between the United States and China is going to develop. So if you take that point where we still don't know, some countries are still trying to balance themselves between the two. Now, the UAE and Bahrain, that both of them suffered a lot in the last attack from Iran. They chose a side. They decided to fight against, let's say, Iranian financial accounts that are in their country. They have helped military-wise, intelligence-wise, behind the scenes a lot. And they also helped Israelis on their expense leave the UAE. So they have helped tremendously the US throughout this war. Also Bahrain. Now, those two countries have decided, the same as Israel. We've decided on the way we're going to act in the next few years. But think about just the same as the US against the Soviet Union. Okay, you had blocs and you had countries that took sides, but it was obvious that they were in war with each other. We're now at the stage of unpeace. If you call in international relations, you have a term called unpeace. It's not yet war, but we are on the bridge of going to that stage, where the estimation is that in 2027, that's when it will be 100 years for the unification of the Communist Party in China. That's when they're going to attack Taiwan. Now, that is a tipping point for the US, and that's what Trump is trying to avoid right now. And in that point, I think countries like Saudi Arabia or India will have to choose clearly, but now they still don't, and they don't know where it's going to develop. The same with Iran. You don't know if the regime is going to topple. You don't know. And you can't make your assumptions on your foreign policy on the base of, yes, maybe it will. Things like that, also especially in the Middle East, take time. And differently, Westerners, where we think that things have to be quick, because that's what we used to. In the Middle East, things take time, and the Arab countries know this. So it's not from today to tomorrow.
Yeah, the Saudis' second or first largest oil customer is China. And so the Saudis need to be attentive to it. But if you look at the groupings in the Middle East, most recently, you see these several different meetings. The most recent was in Antalya in Turkey, where Egypt, Saudi, Turkey, and Pakistan were lining up together. Yeah. There was a recent column in Pan-Arab Al-Sharq Al-Awsat by Yusuf Al-Dini, and he said this is the new centerless world. And I think that this represents a Saudi aspiration, right? That they're no longer living in a U.S.-dominated international system. It's centerless, and therefore this grouping will sort of make the Middle East a pole in the multipolar world. And I think this is more aspirational than reality, but it represents how I think some in Saudi Arabia are seeing the future, whereas Bahrain and together with the Emirates, I think they're still rooted in the Abraham Accords model, which is U.S., Israel. Yes, we believe in sort of a network multipolar world economically, but when we're talking about security issues, I think because they're both small states, and they don't have necessarily that special relationship with China that Daniela was alluding to, they still see their security rooted, at least partially, in an American and or Israeli relationship.
Interesting.
You can also see that with the other countries, not in the Middle East. Morocco, let's say Spain now decided that they're on the side of China with everything that happened with Hormuz. Morocco just signed with the US a huge deal to secure the ports and the strait there. The same with Indonesia, the same with Japan, the same with the Philippines. So you're seeing countries that are choosing a side and signing security and economic deals with the US in order to weaken China, because they are already threatened. Like Morocco is not threatened by China, but the Philippines are for already a couple of years now. So you do see that countries are starting to take a side, but yet I agree 100% about the way that Saudi views the situation currently.
Interesting. We started with the Iran war in the regional sense, but I think now we're moving into a more international sphere, the polarization of the world and the way that this war kind of shifts the global alliances, which I think is really interesting.
I'll just say one word about that. There's been a lot of talk in the last 15 years about this notion of living polarity and multipolarity. And Danielle, you'll have to forgive me here. I'm not an international relations person. And I think that these conversations about polarity oftentimes lead to sort of oversimplifications that don't represent the complexity of the reality we're living in. But the point I wanted to make here is, who's been the dominant actor in the Middle East, at least from, not just from an Israeli perspective, for the last 3 years? Everyone's sort of been reacting to the U.S. and Trump. And now you can argue whether you like or don't like Make America Great Again, but there's no doubt that everyone has been reacting to what the United States is doing. And to me, that's not a sign of a more multipolar world. It's actually a sign of a more American-dominated world. Now, I'm not necessarily endorsing that reality, but it seems to be that's the reality we've been living in.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm trying to see what we haven't covered. Just something that I dug up while we were talking. Going back to Qatar, I saw this really interesting interview conducted in Arabic in Al Jazeera. Just before the Ras Laffan attack, the big attack on the natural gas, in Qatar. It was a very interesting interview conducted by Al Jazeera, which is, semi-official Qatari, with the head of a Qatari Institute of Research. So it's, to a large extent, the Qatari state point of view. And it was a really interesting interview about why doesn't Qatar and the Gulf states in general, why don't they join the Iran war directly? Why do they stay on the sidelines? Really interesting interview. And what he said, he made several points. The first was that he said, and this kind of goes back to Qatar trying to be in the middle of everything. He says, we're not naive, right? First of all, sure, Iran has an agenda. That's why it attacks us, took us hostage. He says it, he says it quite harshly. But then he also says, but also the United States and Israel have their own agenda, which is why they attacked Iran. And neither of these agenda is our agenda. So we need to take care of ourselves. We need to look out for ourselves. And of course, there was also this suspicion. I'm not sure if he made it into interview, but there were these undertones of, maybe Israel kind of hijacked American foreign policy in that sense as well. He also said, which I thought was interesting, we are used to working mainly through diplomacy. We don't, pull out our guns immediately and start shooting. We want to see if we can make good diplomacy and resolve the situation in a diplomatic way. And another interesting point that he made, he talked about this phenomenon known, I think in English it's oil shock. Basically, he said the Gulf states in general are full, and this is really interesting because it was before the Ras Laffan attack. The Gulf states are full of very sensitive infrastructures, such as oil installations that are very easy to attack and to burn up and to blow up, which would create very serious economic damage. It's very hard to protect ourselves from that kind of damage, so we prefer to avoid any wars, which I thought was a really interesting point, especially in retrospect, just something that I wanted to kind of dig out while we were talking.
It's also a tiny state, with 400 to 500,000 citizens. and not much of a strategic culture of war. I think that's important too. Not every state is the same, in terms of its attitudes towards war. And so I think built into the Qatari history is their way of doing business. And I think that interview expressed a good deal of truth to it.
Yeah, I think in this aspect, there's two very interesting distinctions between states that maybe we could make. The first one is a bit, I would say, a psychological sort of perception of a state of itself. So, for example, here in Israel, we live in a very small country. We feel very threatened. We have this basic insecurity about us. We're always concerned that we're not going to exist tomorrow. And I think that's a very major component of how decisions are made here and how we see politics, the severity with which we see politics. Whereas, a country like Iran or maybe some of the Gulf states, they have been here for a long time. They feel that they have a long presence in the Middle East, and that kind of changes. If you spoke about how in the Middle East things take a longer time, we see it with Iran, for example. I think it's a really good example for that. They don't mind playing the long game. Sure, I
think that's true with Iran, but it's important to keep in mind with the Arab Gulf states, many of them are younger than Israel.
Of course, but they, I think a lot of them would sort of see themselves as part of a longer tradition of, maybe even the inception of Islam, or it depends on how they view their history.
Sure. The only thing is, it does seem like their perception of how they should conduct their foreign policy is a bit similar to the EU. And not really to an Arab state. Because usually the Arab states...
Wait, who are you talking about right now?
The Gulf states.
Okay, the Gulf states in general, okay.
Dealing with military issues and threats through diplomacy is great until a point. But paying protection money in order not to be harmed can flip very easily against you. And I think that's a bit the way that the EU is conducting itself currently. And that's why it's extremely surprising to the Israeli street that the Gulf states didn't join. Because you conceive them as Arab states that use force, which Israel was used to throughout the years. And suddenly you see them choosing diplomacy instead, which is aligned with the EU. And I think that raises a lot of eyebrows here of, how did they actually get to that?
So that's
just one point on the history
please.
there. I mean, there's a long history in the Gulf, which is really interesting. There was a Suleiman Khalaf who was an anthropologist based in the UAE, but he was Syrian of origin, wrote this great article called The Politics of Protection about the Gulf states. This is you could say, a politics in the Gulf that's gone on going back to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman protection, and after the Ottoman protection, the British protection. This notion of buying safety is something deeply rooted in the Gulf. And yes, very different than what we know in the Mashrek with Egypt or Syria, the history of Israel's wars with the Arab and its Arab neighbors. In the Gulf, it's a very different strategic culture. So I like everyone sitting at the table, I'm also often asked, why aren't they going to war? If they're getting hit, why aren't they hitting back? And I think we need to take a look at the Gulf and realize they have a different strategic culture and history than other states that we know better in the Arab world.
Well, I'm ought to thank both of you, because you just brought me to the next topic that I wanted to discuss. So I'll just complete what I was going to say before, that the other distinction, and you brought it up, is between countries whose, let's say, their reflex is military as opposed to diplomatic, which create a lot of discrepancies here in this war. I think Israelis, as you said, are very used to, there's a problem, we address it militarily, whereas these countries have different approaches on how to address an international crisis. So let's talk a bit about this sort of, at least for Israelis, the surprising response or lack of response, the way it seems to some people here, of the Gulf states to the attacks of Iran. Basically, Iran makes a very bold move, which I think will be very interesting to understand as facts become more known. But they make this very surprising decision to basically strike at every country around them, Even countries like the Gulf states, which absolutely had no intention of getting involved, at least definitely not in the beginning. They were not, well, it's debatable whether they were even made aware of this war before it happened, and they just found themselves in the crossfire. And as you said, a lot of people here are surprised. Why won't they respond? Why don't they do anything? So we spoke a bit about the focus on diplomacy. Me being a researcher of the UN role in the Arab-Israeli conflict, unlike many Israelis, I was very attentive to what was going on in the Security Council as well, where, by the way, Bahrain is a member right now, and they leveraged their position as a member to sort of bring up a discussion about Iran. They were trying to condemn Iran, which was vetoed, obviously, by Russia and China, but that was an interesting issue. We saw a lot of Arab meetings, summits, with various leaderships. Egypt, by the way, was, as you said, also involved. We saw Pakistan being involved. But there were very few reports about Gulf states striking at Iran. There was some. Most of them were denied by the countries after the fact, which I also thought was interesting. So let's delve a bit more into that. Why is it that they... So I think there are a few topics to bring up here, and you're welcome to address these or any other if you'd like. The first is, and that goes back to something you said, Brandon, they have a history of, for the lack of a nicer word, of sort of outsourcing their security. As you said, there's a lot of countries that helped them with security in the past. The most recent example is, of course, the United States with Saddam Hussein and the Gulf Wars and all of that. So that's one issue. Then we talked about the focus on diplomacy and other means of sort of international interaction as opposed to military force. Anything else, maybe something you want to talk about in this context or other topics that come to mind?
I think the fact that we can't see doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So first of all these countries do have military and they do have intelligence. And the fact that Israel and the US are cooperating so well means that these countries can assist in different ways. If it's economically, if it's military-wise, but not through striking. So I think that assuming that they're just not doing anything is wrong, especially because these countries, a lot of the times when it comes to Israel or choosing a specific obvious side, they do things behind the scenes. So I'm sure that in the future we will understand how they did contribute, especially the UAE and Bahrain. But I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they have done nothing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's interesting. We touched on the Saudi position in terms of Gulf security moving forward, which is continuing to play this diversification game, a centerless security model where they're not leaning on anyone too exclusively. We talked about the Emiratis and perhaps the Bahrainis also wanting to see more Abraham Accords-like security arrangements. And then you talked about Qatar, and one of the things I didn't have a chance to say is what we saw from HBJ, Hamad bin Jassim, who was the former prime minister and foreign minister of Qatar. He's been calling for more GCC, more collective security in the Gulf, which is really interesting. I mean, the GCC was created during the Iran-Iraq War. One of the notions was that there would be collective Gulf security in response to the Iran not getting in the crossfire of the Iran-Iraq War. It never really happened, and I think it's frankly still very unrealistic. Like the idea that all 6 of the GCC states will cooperate in collective defense seems to me very far-fetched. But the fact that the Qataris are pushing it is very interesting. They want to see it. And I think that it means it, as far-fetched as I see it, it could still happen in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's one of several different things that do happen. And if it does happen, I think it will be very interesting because there's a lot of, I would say, shared identity, cultural identity in the Gulf, Khaliji identity, but what it hasn't really translated into sort of a shared political security relationship in the Gulf. And it'll be interesting to see if this war changes that in some way, shape, or form.
Maybe you also have to look at it that, as you said in the interview, Qatar have their own interests, and each one of those states, even with shared culture and shared identity, in some of the cases, they all have their own different interests. And I believe that I just forgot I lost the thread of my thought.
I think the thread you just mentioned is crucial. At the end of the day,
I remember. Sorry. Continue. No. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to just say that just before the war, and this is something that we forgot, Saudi Arabia attacked a UAE ship. So there was a clash going on there before this erupted. Just saying and highlighting the fact that they have different interests, even though they're very similar. So this huge corporation that they're trying to bring may happen, but up until now we haven't seen it.
We saw it in many interesting instances. We saw in the Sudan civil war, the Gulf states were not always on the same page.
Yep.
We saw it, as you mentioned, in Yemen, all sorts of occasions where we saw...
And I think that highlights the crucial point is that, if anything, to my mind, what the war has shown is that the Gulf states, we can't talk about them as Gulf states anymore. They're independent states, and they all have their own independent national interests. If anything, what this war has shown has sort of raised their national consciousness and sharpened their sense of what their particular individual interests are as countries. And to me, that's important.
Wonderful. So unfortunately, our discussion is coming to a close slowly. One issue that I would love to raise before we finish is how this war might change security perception and other forms of perception in the Gulf. Talking about the Gulf states in general, or just some of the countries. If you could talk about this a little bit, I'll give you some pointers here. What would you say? How would you say would this affect the relations with the U.S., with Iran, with Israel? You spoke about the hedging policy that sometimes is used. Would hedging continue? You said they might be forced to choose a side. Would you say that maybe they might focus more on military than before? Maybe not. Maybe some economic changes. You mentioned IMEC, which might become a more interesting issue now that the Houthis control Bab el-Mandab and the Iranians control Straits of Hormuz, if they will. Other pointers, whatever you want to talk.
I'll base my answer on the things and the steps that the UAE are already taking right now. So up until half a year ago, they didn't want to hear about any other public project with Israel. Slowly, they're coming back. One of the main projects they're investing in is Prosperity, which is connecting water and energy between Jordan, Israel, and the UAE. And this is the beginning, it's the foundations for IMEC, because IMEC is extremely important for the UAE, and they're going to push it even harder than what they did before. Israel is a bit nonchalant about it, but Israel should be in the front of pushing this agenda, because easily it can be left out, especially after the 7th of October, where we saw how fragile things are in our country. So I believe that the UAE and Bahrain are going to push for the integration, the economic integration. That's going to also be a security cooperation between the countries. Saudi Arabia, I don't see it changing anytime soon. I hope it will. I was in a conference, and I did hear that the tones towards Israel from the officials there from Saudi Arabia weren't as hostile towards Israel, yet I don't believe that there is a very big love story as well.
But I have to say about this, and I think it was brought up at some point of our discussion, a lot of the things, I think actually you said it, Daniela, is a lot of the times here in the Middle East, things are not as they seem. A lot is happening in closed rooms that is not happening outside. And I have to say, again, as a researcher of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the interesting interactions that you see behind closed doors is illuminating. But yeah.
So let me just take a second and promote the Moshe Dayan Center's new master's program
Please.
in applied Middle Eastern studies. It's a program that's going to put Israelis and international students in classrooms together to talk about these issues that we've been discussing here. So for those of you listening, both in Israel and outside of Israel, who may want to come to Tel Aviv University and dig into these issues a little bit more deeply with people like Daniela and I and you, Jonathan, I think that registration will be open soon, and I encourage you all to take a look at the program.
Absolutely.
In terms of what we can expect moving forward, there was this really interesting column written by Mohanad Saloom, who's an Iraqi scholar based in Qatar, and he said that moving forward, the Gulf states, which are now absorbing $100 billion of damage as a result of the war, and that's a conservative estimate. There was a UN development program report that estimated it could be as high as $200 billion in damage. But I think he said that moving forward, the Gulf states need to demand of the U.S. three things. And it was really interesting. The first is somehow there has to be room in their relationship with the U.S. to be consulted before the U.S. goes to war if they're going to be in the crossfire. Okay, it's something that hasn't existed. Whether that's a realistic demand or not, I'm not sure. The second demand he pointed out, which is really interesting, is they're going to need to pursue more autonomous defense relationships, meaning they're going to need to diversify their procurement. And this was really interesting. These Gulf states, for the most part, rely on U.S. equipment for their defense and U.S. intelligence and a whole infrastructure of relationships that's heavily based in the West and the United States. They're going to need European systems, maybe Asian systems. They're going to need to develop their own defense capabilities. And perhaps, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, even some kind of joint Gulf capability. Maybe the air defense that Israel was somehow involved in for a brief period of time through the Americans. And finally, the third, which is most relevant to what's going on now, which is right now there are negotiations taking place to end the war, which involve Iran and the United States, but not the Arab Gulf states. And they've been the ones who've been absorbing a vast majority of the damage. They feel, or they should feel moving forward, that they have earned a right to sit down at the negotiating table and be a part of whatever discussions are taking place.
Maybe I'll just add to that even after the ceasefire entered place, we still saw Iranian drones and missiles being fired at Gulf states, and it's sort of a non-issue in the negotiations, which also I found really interesting.
And the thing is, if the US won't chip in, then China will.
Probably.
So so it's something that the US has to consider very carefully because they want these guys on their side.
Interesting. So we mentioned a lot of different options, maybe diversification, maybe actually becoming more polarized. I think it's a very interesting take to close with. Thank you both for being with us. Thank you all for being with us too. We'd love if you liked it. We'd love if you could like, subscribe, and follow us for the next episodes. Now that the war is over, we intend to get back in full force. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tel Aviv 360, Israel's largest and most diverse podcast.